in the survey. This is important because it allows those of us on the monitoring team to understand what the community's assessment is of the progress that Newark PD is making under the consent decree, and just what is the relationship currently between the day-to-day interactions of Newark police officers and members of the Newark community. Tonight, we're going to discuss two, I should also say thank you to Ryan Haygood, our fearless leader of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. He and his team, including Brooke, have been quite helpful, and they are our community engagement subject matter experts with respect to the implementation of the consent decree and our oversight of it. We're going to discuss two quarterly reports. Under the consent decree, the independent monitoring team issues on a quarterly basis a report regarding NPD's and the city's compliance with the consent decree. Tonight, we're going to discuss two of them. 14th quarterly report that covers the period April 1 through June 30th, 2020, and the 15th quarterly report that covers the period July 1 through September 2020. We're going to talk, we'll be filing the 16th the 16th quarterly report that will cover the period of October through December 2020 in the next 30 to 45 days, 30 to 60 days. Let's start with the 14th quarterly report. Again, that period of time is April 1 through June 30th, 2020. There are a lot of positive developments here that we wish to share with you. One, let's start with property and evidence. One of the most important areas of the consent decree has to do with how Newark PD handles property, how Newark PD handles evidence that's going to be used in criminal proceedings, whether in Newark Municipal Court or through the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. The monitoring team during this period approved the property and evidence procedural manual. Now, this procedural manual is intended to provide comprehensive written instructions to the daily operations of officers assigned to the property and evidence division. We have worked as a monitoring team very hard with members of the property and evidence division of Newark PD to develop this manual, and it's a good manual. It represents modern property collection practices and property maintenance practices and modern evidence collection and evidence maintenance practices. Again, an overarching issue in the consent decree is that sooner or later, Newark PD is going to have to be allocated the money by the city to build a new property and evidence building. It needs it because modern police departments have modern property and evidence facilities. But until that's done, this manual will help officers on a day-to-day basis understand how to handle property, could be a wheelchair or a bicycle found on the street, and how to handle evidence. And much can be said quite positively about the work of the Property and Evidence Division, who helped put this document together. It is now in place. Also, during this time period, the monitoring team and the parties to the consent decree, and by parties I mean Newark PD, the city of Newark, and on the other side of the table, the U.S. Department of Justice, work together to continue to conduct audits. As you might recall, those of you who are veterans of the consent decree process, here's what you know. The consent decree process required the writing of new policies or the rewriting of existing policies. It also required the writing of new training or the rewriting of existing training. And then after that training has been administered to police officers, the monitoring team comes in after a 90-day period when the last officer has been trained on the new policy and the new training and conducts an audit to determine, are the practices on the street compatible, consistent with the new or revised policy and the new or revised training. So the monitoring team conducted its first use of force audit during the 14th quarterly report period, again, April 1 through June 30th, 2020. That remote audit began February of 2020. NPD saved copies of relevant body-worn camera videos on encrypted, password-protected external drives. And all of these records were provided to the monitoring team for its review. The monitoring team commenced reviewing that material. Again, that's the first use of force audit. The second audit that the monitoring team began is the first stops audit. Now, stops means stops either by car or a stop on the street. And that audit began in July of 2020. It covered data from the period October 1, 2019 to December 31, 2019. NPD's revised stop report became operative June 2020. Again, this is the revised stop report, is the report by which officers collect information about stops that the officers make, whether someone is in a motor vehicle or on the street. So this particular audit, the first stops audit, will not include information from the revised stop report. It will be based upon the prior stop report, because that was the stop report being used during the period of October 1, 2019 to December 31, 2019, when this audit began. The third audit that began in the 14th quarterly report period, April 1 through June 30th, 2020, again, that is the second training audits report. So this is an audit of how Newark PD keeps records of who has been trained, who has not been trained. This audit began in May of 2020. The results were provided in the 15th quarterly report that I'm going to discuss shortly. And in that connection, on June 25th, 2020, Newark PD issued a memorandum stating that trainings would resume in the following areas. Trainings had to be suspended because of COVID-19. As you might recall, New Jersey had a state of emergency, the city of Newark had a state of emergency, and in-person training could not occur. The reason we train in person, and that's the preferred way of training, is because there is more of a conversation that occurs between the officers being trained and the instructors who are conducting the training. It is preferable to video training, much like the video format we're using tonight, because it allows for more interaction and more conversation. Those trainings had to be suspended for safety reasons, health and safety reasons, as you might imagine, as many of us have been working from home during this time period. So on June 25th, 2020, Newark PD issued a memorandum stating that the trainings would resume in the following areas: stops, again, car stops and on the street stops, searches with a warrant, searches without a warrant. The third area, arrests with a warrant, arrests without a warrant. And the fourth area, bias-free policing. I might point out that Newark is one of the few police departments in the nation that has a specific policy that prohibits bias in policing. There's policy and there's also training that accompanies it. One bright spot among others for Newark PD during the 14th quarterly reporting period is the interaction between the community and the Newark police after the killing in Minneapolis of George Floyd. You know, in contrast to the 1967 Newark Rebellion, NPD's response to the protests were nonviolent across the board. That is a tribute to the policies and training of the Newark PD, the management and oversight of the Newark PD, as well as the community itself. So community groups and members of the community were very instrumental, along with the Newark PD, in keeping protests peaceful. NPD has made tremendous progress in working with the community across the board, not just on this particular incident and at this particular moment, but across the board. One area that we are paying attention to, and we know Newark PD is paying attention to, is a youth engagement strategy. if you're going to have an effective community engagement strategy that necessarily includes engagement with young people who one day are going to become adults. And so we are working with Newark PD to help develop modern youth engagement strategies, not just events, but a strategy that is designed precinct by precinct in the same way the community engagement strategy is set forth in a policy precinct by precinct, and the training that accompanies it precinct by precinct with measurables on a quarterly basis and reports on a quarterly basis. During this particular period, the monitoring team was looking forward to receiving, which we ultimately did receive from Newark, a youth engagement strategy, and we're going to offer comments to Newark very shortly about that youth engagement strategy. Also, on June 4th and June 9th, 2020, regarding the use of force policy, the Director of Public Safety, Anthony Ambrose, issued 2 memoranda re-emphasizing MPD's general prohibition against neck holds and guiding principles regarding the use of force policy. These kinds of reminders are very important because they remind officers of the policy, they remind officers of the training. And quite thoughtfully, the director issued these reminders on June 4th and June 9th, 2020. From July 8th to July 23rd, 2020, NPD aired short broadcasts over officers' in-car radios, reminding officers and all personnel of their obligations under the use of force policy. Again, these reminders are most important and quite helpful. Some of you may know in the community, on June 24th, 2020, the city passed an ordinance requiring the relocation of the first precinct by December 31, the end of last year. I'm sorry, by December 31, 2021, to make way for the Office of Violence Prevention. So where the first precinct is now, sometime after December 31 of this year, that will now be the location of the Office of Violence Prevention. The ordinance that was passed also provides for the automatic termination of city employees who either commit acts of racism or commit acts of racial discrimination or fail to intervene and report such acts of racism or racial discrimination. Additionally, 5% of the Department of Public Safety's budget will be reallocated from the police to fund the Office of Violence Prevention that will be located where the first precinct is now. Those are the highlights of the 14th quarterly report, again, covering the period April 1 through June 30th, 2020. We urge you to obtain more detail by reading the reports themselves, or this particular report itself. Now on to the 15th quarterly report. This quarterly report covered the period July 1 through September 30th, 2020. And there are a couple of topics that we want to review. We're going to talk about audits. We're going to talk about surveys that were conducted and the results of those surveys. We're also going to talk about some other developments. Let's start with the Civilian Complaint Review Board that has captured, and rightly so, great interest of the Newark community. Many know that paragraph 13 of the consent decree establishes a civilian oversight entity. Newark complied with that paragraph by passing an ordinance that established a comprehensive Civilian Complaint Review Board with very broad powers. A challenge was brought concerning the powers granted to that Civilian Complaint Review Board. It worked its way through the Superior Court in Essex County to the Appellate Division and ultimately to the New Jersey Supreme Court. On August 19th, 2020, the New Jersey Supreme Court held that the city's CCRB, that's the Civilian Complaint Review Board, is not permitted to exercise its investigatory powers when there is a concurrent, ongoing investigation conducted by NPD's Internal Affairs Unit. So if the Internal Affairs Unit is conducting its investigation, the CCRB cannot conduct a parallel investigation according to the New Jersey Supreme Court. Secondly, the Supreme Court ruled that the CCRB does not have subpoena powers under current New Jersey state law. The city has commented that it intends to raise concerns about this ruling, and that it may seek a legislative solution in the New Jersey legislature. And it remains to be seen how that process will ultimately turn out. Let's talk about the second training records audit. This is the second audit of the training records maintained by Newark PD that capture what training officers have had, what trainings they have not had. The audit period for the trainings, as reported in the 15th quarterly report, occurred from March 1, 2019 to December 31, 2019. So that was a period of time in which the records were examined. The records were examined for period March 1, 2019 to December 31, 2019. The areas examined to determine whether or not the trainings had been conducted were the following: community-oriented policing. The second was body-worn cameras and in-car cameras. The third was use of force. And the fourth included stops, searches, and arrests. Here are the findings of that second training records audit. More than 95% of the officers had received use of force training, body-worn camera training, in-car camera training. Secondly, just under 95% of the officers received community-oriented policing training, as well as training on stops, training on searches, and training on arrests. Now, the pass rate when we conduct these audits is 95%. And as many of you know, when Newark passes a particular task on 2 consecutive audit periods of at least 95%, the consent decree deems that practice to be institutionalized in the police force, and therefore the police force is relieved from further audits. So Newark came very close with respect to its training records audit. We made a few recommendations as a monitoring team with respect to training records in the future that we thought would be helpful. Number one, we think that with respect to all training, that a passing rate should be established for all the training that's given for every single course. There should be a designated passing rate established. Secondly, when new officers arrive from county training, county recruit training, new officers to NPD, or they return from a long-term absence, they should be required to undergo consent decree training to refresh their minds about what the consent decree requires and what their obligations as officers are under the consent decree. They should immediately receive a briefing on core requirements relating to use of force, because as we all know, use of force can be problematic in any police organization. Stops, searches, arrests, body-worn cameras, and in-car cameras. The third area for our recommendation includes that we've recommended that a weekly training report should be reinstituted in NPD, which will show all of the training activity as well as courses outside of the department that an officer may be taking. so that commanders in NPD have a comprehensive view about what training officers are getting, what training they're not getting, including courses outside of the NPD. For example, officers may be attending night school, they may be pursuing graduate level education, and that should be included in a training report. We think that training activity ought to be prepared and updated weekly. Newark adopted this recommendation and reported to the monitoring team that the weekly training report has been reinstituted and is now in full force and effect. Another recommendation, a fourth recommendation that we made, is that the schedule and content for the required 40 hours of in-service consent decree training should be developed and implemented immediately. The consent decree requires that 40 hours of in-service consent decree training be given on an annual basis. And in order to do that, you need a schedule, because you can't take all of the officers off the street at one particular time, or you certainly can't take them from one single precinct all at once. You have to develop a schedule so that you stagger these trainings, so officers can still fulfill their patrol functions, and you don't make scarce officers in any particular area of the city while they're undergoing this very important training. And the last recommendation we made had to do with a data system that Newark uses. It's called Power DMS. And in our view of our subject matter experts and the monitoring team, that system needs to be improved so that the fields in the system, the columns in the system, show all outstanding consent decree courses that individual officers have not received as of yet. We also reported in the 15th quarterly report, again covering the period of July 1 through September 30th, 2020, an issue and concern involving the LGBTQ community. And it is as follows. To Newark PD's credit, it established an LGBTQ policy. It was not required by the consent decree. And Newark PD decided admirably on its own to establish such a policy. That is important because we have to affirm the humanity of members of the LGBTQI communities. And we have to be sure that procedures are in place to make sure that not only their humanity is affirmed, but that they're protected, and that cases involving any harm, mostly due to prejudice, that may befall them, are aggressively investigated. So NPD admirably implemented an LGBTQ policy. And in order to do that, it invited stakeholders in the community to provide feedback on the draft policy. And that is the way it should be done. And in fact, NPD has done this for a number of other policies. Some of you may have attended those community meetings where the policy was presented, it was made available to you, you read it, you offered comments about what you thought could be said more clearly, what you thought could be included that may not have been included. On April 3rd, 2019, NPD implemented, after community feedback, General Order 19-3, and that is the LGBTQ community and police interaction policy. On April 1, 2020, subsequent to the implementation of the policy, almost a year to the day that the policy was implemented, the body of Ashley Moore, a Black transgender woman, was found in Newark. Ms. Moore's family was not immediately notified about her death. Her death was initially ruled a suicide, which raised concerns in the LGBTQ and broader community. As a result, the Essex County Prosecutor's Office's Homicide Task Force decided to investigate Ms. Moore's death. As a result of examining the circumstances surrounding Ms. Moore's death and the investigation of it and the notifications that were not given as a result of it, Newark PD, to its credit, changed its policies and it modified them, which is the sign of a modern police organization, where you see that your policy is well-intentioned, but it has gaps. The thoughtful police commanders go back, examine that policy, identify what can be changed on it, and they make those changes. NPD did that here. The city and NPD announced the following reforms. And these are three significant policy reforms. One, a hotline was established. That number, by the way, is 973-733-8809. I'll give it to you again. 973-733-8809. This is a hotline operated by the Shani Baraka Women's Resource Center, and it connects LGBTQ residents with social services that they may need and additional support. Secondly, the city passed the Ashley Moore Amendment. Actually, NPD did this. The Ashley Moore Amendment to the existing LGBTQ policy to require NPD to contact local LGBTQ organizations and activists if officers need assistance, such as help identifying next of kin or help with the person who's been victimized, who is a member of the LGBTQ community. And folks, unfortunately, we still have very narrow-minded people in the world who want to hurt people who are different. And it's no different than racial prejudice, gender prejudice, and this is a different kind of prejudice against LGBTQ people. And so the Ashley Moore Amendment that NPD implemented will connect members of the LGBTQ community to advisors, stakeholders, thoughtful activists who can help give assistance to members of the community as well as to NPD. And the third item here is NPD added an option to its police reports so that people can choose to identify themselves as members of the LGBTQ community. So gone are the days when someone who is a police officer decides what your identity will be. This allows a member of the LGBTQ community to identify herself, himself, yours, them, however that person wishes to be identified in police reports, so that we, again, affirm humanity and affirm dignity by allowing the person to define herself, himself, or themselves. After this amendment to the policy was implemented, NPD and the LGBTQ focus groups began to meet to discuss training and development. On August 27, 2020, NPD informed the monitoring team that it had administered a, quote, law enforcement interactives with transgender individuals training. This is a specialized training. I'll say the name again. Law enforcement interactives with transgender individuals training that was created by the New Jersey Office of the Attorney General. So the Attorney General created this training. Newark has adopted it. It has delivered that training. And our only recommendation is that we should be sure that NPD includes scenarios in the training, because scenario-based training is adult-based learning. It gives officers real-life game situations, real-life on-the-street encounters as scenarios to help officers think through what makes sense. Now, let me end on the 15th quarterly report with this idea. Surveys. The consent decree requires that the monitoring team conduct surveys. We did two kinds. One is called a probability survey. That's a telephone survey. The second is called a non-probability survey. That's an on-the-street survey. So I'll talk about these two surveys. We did our third probability telephone survey between May 27th and May 30th of 2020. Here are the highlights. And there's some good news here. With respect to respondents who said that they had never had a positive experience with the NPD, there was a 46% decrease in those persons between the second probability survey and this third probability survey as of May 27th and May 30th of 2020. So it showed that more people reported a positive experience with NPD. Also, a good news story, of those respondents who answered that an officer was, quote, helpful even when she or he didn't have to be, there was an 18% increase in persons who said something positive, namely that an officer was helpful even when she or he didn't have to be. That's an 18-point increase from the second probability survey, telephone survey, and this one, the third probability survey. There's some areas for improvement. There was a 9-point decrease among those who filed a formal complaint with the Newark police and felt, quote, somewhat satisfied, that's the survey question, somewhat satisfied with the result, a 9-point decrease. An 8-point increase in those who filed the complaint but were, quote, not satisfied at all, end quote, with the result. And interestingly, 67% of white respondents were, quote, very satisfied with how their complaint was handled, as compared to only 11% of Black respondents. After reviewing these survey results on the probability telephone survey, we made, as a monitoring team, a couple of recommendations. One is NPD should continue to focus on improving its relationship with the Black community in Newark and bolster its social media efforts. Secondly, NPD should amplify Black voices and open a deeper dialogue between NPD and African Americans, Latinx people, and other people of color. Now, with respect to the third non-probability study, the survey, this is a street survey. This is stopping people on the street and asking them to participate. And ladies and gentlemen, if you are stopped on the street by a survey person who says, I'm doing a survey on the Newark police, we urge you to participate in it so that we can acquire information. The timeline for this on the street survey was November and December of 2019. Again, the telephone survey was May 27th through May 30th, 2020. This on the street survey occurred before that, November and December of 2019. Here are the highlights. When asked to rate the job that the Newark police were doing to serve the people in their neighborhood, 28% of the respondents rated them good. 34% rated them fair. 34% rated them fair. When we compare that to the second street survey, 22% rated Newark police as good. Again, it was an increase, 28, the prior survey was 22, and 31% rated Newark PD fair. And again, that was an increase. In the most recent street survey, 34 rated fair. In the prior survey, 31 rated fair, 31%. So that was an improvement. Secondly, 15% of respondents answered none at all when asked how much trust they have in the Newark police. That is a 17-point decrease from the second street survey. Now, unfortunately, when we ask these questions on the street, often we don't get an explanation as to why that's the case. But 15% of respondents, when asked how much trust they have in the Newark police, 15% said none at all. That represents a 17-point decrease from the second street survey. Let me say that again. When asked on the street how much trust they have for the Newark police, 15% of the respondents said none at all. That's a 17-point decrease from the second street survey. When asked about how NPD officers' attendance at community events compares as between prior surveys and right now, 24% answered that officers attended events all the time. 36% answered some of the time. 3% answered never. That is an improvement. The second street survey results were 11% all the time. Again, this time, the street survey revealed that 24% answered all the time. With respect to some of the time, earlier, the second street survey, 28% said some of the time. And when answered never, 21% in the second street survey said that NPD never participates. So there was a decrease in the dissatisfaction level among Newark residents when you look at these numbers. Areas of improvement. Only 44% of the respondents answered that they knew how to file a complaint when they wanted to complain about a particular event or incident involving Newark PD. That's an 18% decrease from the second street survey. Respondents were also asked if they believed their complaint would be adequately investigated. Fewer respondents answered yes to this question, 20% as opposed to 25% with the earlier survey, as compared to the previous survey. More respondents answered don't know. So when respondents were asked if they believed their complaint would be adequately investigated, 43% said they didn't know, as opposed to 19% in the previous survey. That doesn't tell us much, but we did have a recommendation that the city and NPD should make complaint forms more readily accessible on the website and more readily accessible throughout the city. And NPD should consider holding community events, more community events. It's difficult to do that now in light of COVID-19, but perhaps virtual community events where NPD explains how community members can file complaints and explain the process that occurs after the complaint is filed. So community residents understand, here is how you go about filing a complaint if you have one. Here's what will happen if you file a complaint. This is how it will be investigated. There is one additional area that I'm not sure I spoke about earlier, and that is the second training records audit. I think I did address that earlier, but suffice it to say, it bears further review. Again, during this period of time, we conducted a second audit of the training records. And as a result of that, we made some recommendations. We know Newark is paying attention to a number of them because at least one or more of our recommendations has been implemented with respect to how Newark maintains its training records. So that is the overview of the 14th quarterly report covering April 1 through June 30th, 2020. And most recently, that's a summary of the 15th quarterly report covering July 1 through September 30th, 2020. And we hope to have the 16th quarterly report. We're writing it now, and that will cover the period October 1 through December 31 of 2020 to close out last year. And we hope to have that report filed in the next 45 to 60 days. So thank you for your time and thank you for listening. And now I think it's important for the community to hear directly from the persons who are providing service to the community. That would be the Newark PD. They have been working very hard on implementing this consent decree. And there are a number of reforms that have been implemented and more to come. So it is far more significant for residents of the city and interested persons to hear directly from the leadership of Newark PD and address any thoughts that the community has about the consent decree, about community engagement, or any other issue directly with Newark PD. Thank you, Brooke.
Thanks so much, Mr. Harvey. So now we'll open it up to NPD to give us some updates about what's been going on in their department.
Thank you, Brooke. Can you give me a quick thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Harvey. I just wanted to check the connection. It started to go towards the end on Peter. I just want to make sure I'm good. Thank you again for having us. Hello to everybody that's out there. I wish we could be in person doing this again. I mean, to me, it feels like forever that we've been able to, get out into the community and have these meetings where we get to talk about what's going on and address a lot of the community concerns. Just to pick up where Mr. Harvey left off. I'll start off with COVID because that's the obvious thing that's affecting us. So since March, we've had over 400 members of the NPD who have tested positive for the coronavirus. We have about 1,000 officers at this point. So obviously 400 is coming close to half. There have been 8 members of the department who have died as a result of the coronavirus. The last, Brian McAdams, we buried him this morning, which was another tough one to see, another person leaving their children behind, dying from this terrible virus. So that has clearly had an impact on the work that we're doing in some very, obvious ways. One of the first things that happened since the pandemic began is the whole department was switched from 8-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts because of the state of emergency. And typically you wouldn't be able to do something like that, but because of the state of emergency, we're able to supersede, collective bargaining agreements, union contracts, and switch officers to that type of shift. And what that does is that enables us to have more officers on the street, even when our numbers are diminishing. So we remain today all of the 12-hour shifts.
No, you already took care of it.
All of our officers remain on 12-hour shifts in order to enhance the deployment of folks on the street, particularly while officers are sick. We also had to cancel vacations for officers for most of this last year. And then at the same time, the city has experienced a fiscal crisis. So between the city not having enough money to cover its municipal budget, and then also funds being diverted to support other areas of the budget, that only leaves so much money to conduct training and that sort of thing. So that's one problem that's occurring. The other obvious thing is when the pandemic started, we needed to cancel all in-person training. So that was shut down for a number of months. We were able to bring it back as the numbers subsided, as they used to talk about flattening the curve. Once there were fewer coronavirus cases in August, we resumed the in-person training until once again we began to experience a spike. And so today, where we are today with in-person training is we conduct the training virtually. So in other words, like the officers will come to whatever their workstation is. They'll come to the precinct that they work in, the detective unit, whatever, and then they'll get on a computer someplace socially distanced and log into the training. And we've had some good feedback with that. both from folks from the monitoring team and from the officers. We've been able to maintain the same quality of training that our officers have experienced. So since the pandemic began up until today, the two courses that we've been trying to get all of our officers through are the stop, search, and arrest training and the bias-free policing training. And as of today, there's 809 officers who received that training, the stop, search, and arrest training, and 771 officers who've received the bias-free policing training. And we want to finish those two courses within the next month so that we can then move on to other training, right? The consent decree, requires 40 hours of additional training every year for our officers. Our emphasis is on making sure that we get all the major issues of the consent decree covered. We'd like to wrap this up and move into community policing and doing another like in-person training for use of force as quickly as possible. And it seems like that'll be a little bit easier in the months ahead. There's still a lot of unknowns in terms of what the city's budget will look like and things like that, and really the effects of the pandemic itself. But I can tell you, I'm very thankful that today I was able to get the second Moderna shot for the coronavirus vaccine. And there's a number of other officers who are also in that position now. And the daily totals have declined again. So around the time, I'd say around Thanksgiving and immediately after Thanksgiving, there were probably about 40 or 50 officers a day that were positive. A total of 40 or 50 that were positive for the coronavirus, and we're down to about the low 20s now, 22 officers that are positive at any given time. So that's positive. The more that that folks get vaccinated and we're able to do that, we're hopeful that we'll be able to restore a little bit more normalcy in these types of things. Mr. Harvey mentioned the department's response to the George Floyd protests, which we are certainly very grateful for. I have some information on that I can report. The NPD responded to a total of 42 protests related to the murder of George Floyd. And 2 of those 42 included some act of property damage or that type of thing. However, there was no level of unrest, and a lot of that is due to folks from the community stepping in and helping the police by de-escalating things before they got out of hand themselves. Right? I've seen videos and that's out there. Folks from the community who just showed up at the 17th Avenue precinct, at the first precinct, during the worst we had. There was about 12,000 people, and it lasted into the night. And a group of a couple hundred of them came up to the first precinct to try and get inside and I guess take the precinct and or burn it, like we had seen happen in other cities. And quite frankly, the only reason why it remains so peaceful is because of the folks in the community who said, no, you're not going to do that here. And we found that we had a number of folks who came from outside of this city with intentions to cause havoc here. And thankfully, because of our residents here, they stepped up and stepped in, and Newark, the situation in Newark was totally different than what happened in other states in New Jersey at that time, even though there were more folks in Newark than there were protesting in other cities in New Jersey, let alone what you see in the rest of the country. So, we're very thankful for that. But, obviously, we realize, no one here can, sit back and kind of rest on their laurels, right? Like there is still quite a bit of work to do. Also very thankful that, Mr. Harvey mentioned the survey results, which are very encouraging. They'd be encouraging on a regular day, let alone when you take into consideration that surveying was beginning a couple days after George Floyd was murdered, right? So I think people all across the country were obviously, enraged and upset about policing in general. So to have a survey, happen in Newark with the history that Newark has as a city with its police, I think is very, very clear that, things are quite different today than they had been years ago. It's not perfect, but it's definitely something that I'm thankful for, to see that things are going in the right direction. And the obligation is on us now to figure out, what else do we have to do to continue to improve things further. Another report, the report mentioned that, the statistics Mr. Harvey was going over in regards to citizen complaints and folks who were satisfied with the results of making complaints. I know from reading Mr. Harvey's report and from the survey data that there was, some pretty stark racial disparities in that data. That in other words, like folks of color, particularly African Americans, were a whole lot less satisfied with what happened. And that's something obviously that's concerning, but it's certainly not a surprise. And it's something that, we're continuing to think about different ways on how we're going to address that and continue to build trust and transparency in the community. There have been some other changes, that I wanted to highlight. In terms of the body-worn camera policy, when we first presented the body-worn camera policy to the community and received feedback, and it was approved and then implemented all across the city, across the department, it initially only required sergeants and police officers who were working in uniform in the field to wear those cameras. There's since been changes to that, right? So, when we did the rollout, we issued cameras to every single member of the department, and we trained everyone in the department, regardless of their rank, regardless of their assignment, in how to use the camera. So then as time went on, the first change we did was we required police officers who are working, they call it outside employment, like the road construction jobs and, security at ShopRite and those kinds of things. We required them to start wearing cameras as well, because what we noticed was we were having complaints. And, I'm sure just like anywhere else, the majority of these complaints are issues of disrespect of an officer's demeanor or their conduct. And, in those kinds of situations, even if you're able to go, which we do, we go and we try and find witnesses and we try and get surveillance video to try and investigate this and to figure out what happened. There's nothing in those kinds of complaints. There's nothing quite like having audio that's recorded from the body-worn camera. So we mandated, that was the first thing we added on. We mandated that all officers working outside employment and road jobs have to start wearing the cameras, and we have seen a slight decrease in complaints from those officers since we made that mandate. The other change that was recent was actually last week, is all officers who work in plain clothes enforcement are required now to wear a camera. And we're thankful that, because I actually had a question at a community meeting earlier this week. Folks were asking that, the monitor and the NPD had reported that all members of the department were trained and issued cameras. They wanted to know then how come plainclothes officers weren't. And the reason was, like I said before, the policy only required, officers working in uniform in the field to wear the camera. So because everyone was already trained and everyone was already issued a camera, with the stroke of a pen, we were able to change the policy, and the public safety director issued a policy requiring all officers in plain clothes to wear cameras. And that obviously was a result of a fatal shooting incident that occurred on New Year's Day that the Attorney General's office is investigating, where a person lost their life. And that's a situation where there is surveillance video, but as the mayor has said publicly, it appears to be tragic, but also inconclusive at this time. And that's just because there's a new law in New Jersey that requires the Attorney General's office to investigate that stuff. So, I and the department, the Newark Police Department, don't know anything else other than what the public knows and what's been said about that kind of thing so far. And that we're, now we're hopeful that, perhaps if we have cameras now basically on everyone that's working out on the street, if a tragedy like that were to happen again, hopefully the video would provide, more evidence and more just, a quicker sense of understanding as to what actually transpired. The other thing I would just, I would want the public to know about these body cameras, actually two things. We've seen since they were initially rolled out, we've seen, and I think the team here with me would agree, we've seen, an extraordinary change in officers' attitudes towards these cameras, right? In the beginning, just like every other thing that we're trying to implement under the consent decree, in the beginning, it was kind of like, the worst thing going, and cops hated it and so on. The reality is, last year's citizen complaints that were captured on body-worn cameras, 47% of the time, the video exonerated the officer. So it's almost half of the time that officers are exonerated. Whereas in the past, a lot of these complaints, because the majority of these complaints, like I said, are not, are not that serious. It's stuff about officers being rude, being disrespectful, the way they're speaking to folks and so on. And that's the type of thing that if you have audio from an encounter, it's either going to show it happened or it didn't. And so we've seen, we've seen a lot of buy-in from our officers, and I'm thankful for that. This last change with plainclothes officers, frankly, I wasn't sure how it was going to go over, but I've had two different officers in the last week since it came out come up to me, in the hallway and in the street, and tell me that they're thankful for the change and that it's already been useful for them. So, because the thing that happens a lot of times is, just like our policy requires, the officer has to tell folks that they're being recorded as soon as it's feasible. And there are times that, just telling someone that they're being recorded helps to change the dynamic in the situation, and it helps to make the officer's job easier, and it helps folks it helps to de-escalate the overall situation. There were some other changes. There was an information technology policy that was updated since the last time that we met. And basically that's just to ensure that federal and state privacy laws are maintained in terms of, when we're collecting data under paragraph 54. Paragraph 54 is dealing with the analysis of stop, search, and arrest information. There's some like really good news that I am personally excited about. It might not sound like much to people listening, but if you look at Newark's consent decree, I would estimate, I don't know what Mr. Harvey or anyone else would think, but I would estimate, almost half, slightly less than half, but almost half is about, Newark's ability to collect data and do something about it, right? To analyze the data and then respond to it. And the city had a study done about 2 years ago in terms of how to upgrade technology and things like that. We also brought in a company about a year ago before the pandemic began that could kind of give us something off the shelf to kind of link this stuff together. But there wasn't enough funding at the time. We're fortunate enough that that same company has since been contracted by the Attorney General of New Jersey. And so they're doing like the use of force reporting for the whole state now. And since then, they were able to reduce the cost that it would be for the city of Newark to contract with them. So I'm very thankful, to the public safety director, to the BA, and to the mayor, because there's funds available for that now. We're in the process of contracting with a company. It's called Benchmark Analytics, and they will be able to, link the data together that's required to do the analysis that the consent decree mandates the city to do. So there's stuff that has to be done in terms of looking at, we have to collect additional data, which we have that stuff in place now. We have new reports and new forms in place to make sure that we're collecting all the data that the consent decree requires. But what you really have to be able to do is you have to be able to analyze it and do something about it. And this system is something now that will be able to do that for us. It'll help us, implement a more robust early intervention system which is a system basically that collects, early warning information about officers and helps supervisors intervene before an officer has a problem with a certain area. The other thing that I think is pretty significant, the MPD has drafted a policy on implementing, on how to comply with paragraph 53 of the consent decree. Paragraph 53 is the one that deals with looking at stop and arrest data in terms of, the disparate impact that occurs based on race. So we've been working with the DOJ, and we're very close to finalizing a policy to do that. And we hope to be sending that over to the monitor for the monitor to get a look at it and give us their input very soon. So I think those two things are quite significant, particularly the ability now to have a system that can really analyze this data the way the consent decree needs it to be done. Because I think that's, like I said, that's almost half of the issue in terms of the city being able to comply with the consent decree. I mentioned training earlier. Obviously community engagement has been significantly impacted since the pandemic began, but it is still occurring. And we have our quarterly reports are posted on the MPD consent decree website. You can see where, the different things that happened each quarter last year in terms of community engagement. But there's a number of, new areas that MPD had to get into in terms of engagement since the pandemic happened, right? Like, so there was stuff happening outdoors in the summer months, a lot of stuff around, getting folks masks when this first began, and educating people about the risks and the need for masks and social distancing and that kind of thing. In a similar vein, NPD has been very much involved from the beginning with the city's helping set up NPD and the fire department, and obviously the health department, setting up vaccination sites throughout the city, also providing security at those sites. I'm sorry, first I meant to say testing sites. That was right at the very beginning, helping to set those sites up and providing security for those sites. And now NPD is also involved with helping set up the vaccination sites, which has been going well. Another big area of community engagement, I believe the monitor mentioned it earlier, is the youth engagement strategy that the monitor recommended that we pursue, that we have pursued. And we're very thankful that two groups in particular kind of took the lead on this area with us. It's the All Stars Project of Newark and also the Newark Street Academy. So we had a number of meetings with them, and they kind of then took it on their own to bring it to some young people and some different organizations and get some great feedback from us, which we are now in the process of finalizing that strategy with the monitor. Those are the main things. Oh, I also want to mention issues around the LGBT community. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say, there were a number of folks from the community who led NPD's effort in this area. Folks from the Unity Fellowship Church, Newark, Pastor Kevin Taylor, Pastor Jerry Lee, folks like Amanda Simpson at the HMI Institute, and of course, Beatrice Simpkins from the Newark LGBTQ Community Center, and several others. I know Garden State Equality had been involved and so on, and also Equal Justice USA, of course. These folks essentially took the lead and gave us space to hold meetings. They got folks to come out and help structure this kind of discussion that we've had. And several meetings later, we are where we are today with the policy. The last physical meeting we had with these groups was March 2nd, 2 weeks before, obviously, the pandemic hit. But, we're very thankful for the work that they've been doing, and we've still been in communication since then, because, this is one area in particular that was really led by some folks in the community. And I believe we've had some positive developments that would not have happened if it wasn't for them and the efforts that they put in. Mr. Harvey mentioned, Ashley Moore's death, which is obviously a tragedy. I just want to provide some context to what happened in regard to her death. And this is in no way an excuse for what happened. But the context is what it is. At the end of March, the beginning of April, it was really the height of this pandemic storm, right? And a lot of folks didn't know what was going on. We had a lot of people getting sick very quickly. And the city really was in a true state of emergency. They were bringing in, tractor trailers that were like refrigerated trucks up at University Hospital and storing bodies in there. We were getting so many DOA calls every day because it was compounded. It was compounded by the pandemic, and then folks were afraid because of the pandemic. So they weren't going to the hospital or to their doctor when they should have. So we had more people dying at home from natural causes who would have lived if they weren't so scared to go to the hospital, to go to their doctor. So this was really, an extraordinary time that we were in. We had DOA calls where, the medical examiner couldn't come out. And so, and a funeral parlor couldn't come out. So sometimes we were literally had an officer standing by at someone's house, the dead person, until the next day. That's what was going on at the time in this city when Ashley Moore died. And, I sat, and I'm thankful to the mayor because, once this became an issue, the mayor took the lead on it and brought some folks in. And he looked at the video with some folks representing Ms. Moore's family, and saw that I can at least report, and as the mayor has said publicly, that the officers that night who responded to this emergency did everything they could to save her life, and they treated her with respect, which to me is the most important thing. The problem happened in the follow-up investigation, which is due to all the other chaos going on at that time, where the detectives were not able to identify a next of kin. And that, tragically, that's what happened. But there's since been revisions to ensure that that doesn't happen again, as I mentioned. Yeah, that was a tragedy. But the biggest thing, I just want to highlight is that the officers who responded there that day did absolutely nothing to disrespect this person and actually did everything they could while they were waiting for an ambulance, I think for about 15 minutes, because the ambulances were so backed up, even in the middle of the night, while she was dead on the sidewalk. So yeah, I think that's just one positive thing, at least, is that the officers did act appropriately there. Since then, we've had, like Mr. Harvey mentioned, the Ashley Moore amendments to the LGBTQ policy, the tip line, also the voluntary box on incident reports to try and identify folks from the LGBT community who are victims. The purpose of that is so that we can then reach out to the Newark LGBTQ Center, which they have graciously been willing to do this for us. They'll then jump on and try and contact the victim to let them know that there are special services available for them. And thankfully we have them in that partnership to do that. But I just want to say that these types of changes are not without disagreement, right? We did that because we thought it was necessary, but there were also folks in the community, that were a little bit alarmed that we were creating a box on a police report for folks. It's a conversation that we had, and it's come up a few times, but that's the direction that the department is going in at that point. Since then, we had Amanda Simpson from the HMI Institute. Good. Okay. We've had Amanda Simpson from the HMI Institute has come in, and she trained all of our command staff over the course of 2 days in the NPD's policy, which was her idea, and it was really great. Had been developed, you know, in consultation with the community, and then taught our officers the policy in a totally different way than if it would have been from the police. So that was positive. I also have with me tonight Officer Zamara Santiago. She is one of our new LGBT liaisons. She's been working with Lieutenant Yuri. There's also another officer, a younger officer, Brian Holmes, who works in the 5th Precinct. That's also been involved as an LGBT liaison. So it's something that, you know, like I said, the pandemic has slowed down what we can do in person, but it's still something that we're conscious of and that we want to continue to move forward with in the future. And I think that's the majority of the highlights. I'll turn it back over to Brooke for any questions that folks have.
Great. Thank you so much, Deputy Chief. So now we're going to turn it over to the community where you can all ask your questions. If you do have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many as we can tonight. So for our first question is, and this would be to members of NPD, officers are frequently moving around to different positions within the department, which is harmful to developing strong relationships with community members. Can you explain why there's a lot of movement within the department?
And I don't know, I think there used to be quite a bit more movement. I think it's been much more stable than it had been in the past. Occasionally there is movement when gaps occur, right? Like if you know, there were like 64 people who were promoted last month. So then when those folks get reassigned, you have to kind of, you know, you have nobody else new coming in, and you have, you know, you also have resignations along the way and deaths and things like that. So, you know, sometimes people have to be redistributed just to try and, you know, even things out and fill in gaps. But I don't think there's been too much movement. I do think though, you know, when we switched to 12-hour shifts, there was movement there. There was a lot of movement there because we were going from 8-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts. And that totally changes what you have available for deployment at different times of day. And another thing that was done recently, I think in December, folks who were in like administrative positions and stuff like that, a lot of them were, you know, redeployed to street positions and also to backfill in investigative positions. Yeah, so I think that's what's happening, but I don't think it's necessarily more than what it had been in the past.
Great, thank you. So another question we have is, were any policies created that are related to the disability community? The DOJ's report noted that individuals with disabilities encounter issues when interacting with police. It would be great if NPD could work with local leaders of the disability community to incorporate ADA accommodations and other such policies related to NPD interacting with individuals with disabilities.
Yeah, so I know the city has such policies because it's there's like federal requirements in that area, but I don't know for sure that the police department has specific policies for that.
Okay, great. So this
I should add one thing to that, one comment to it as well. The consent decree does not specifically identify the disabled community as a particular area of focus. And that is the agreement that the Department of Justice has negotiated with the City of Newark that includes the Newark PD. So while it is not a specific area covered by the consent decree, if there are suggestions that members of the physically challenged community or the disabled community wish to make, feel free to make them directly to NPD, whether it's access to police precincts, access to other kinds of technology so that reports can be made, whether that is TTY technology or other kinds of technology. I have no doubt that NPD will be receptive to getting that kind of recommendation or suggestion and evaluating how it can implement a better communication or better relationship with members of the disabled community.
Thanks, Mr. Harvey. This next question is actually directed specifically to you. So the question is, no doubt the changes you've helped bring with the power of the consent decree and partners like the Institute have improved the procedures and behavior of our Newark police. But for generations, progressive Newarkers have believed that nothing short of muscular civilian oversight would produce the most effective, long-lasting police reform. With the state Supreme Court's rejection of subpoena power and oversight of internal affairs for our Civilian Police Review Board, are we blocked from achieving the maximum long-lasting reform of police behavior?
I would say no. The community is not blocked from achieving overall reform. I think reform is happening right now. And I think Deputy Chief O'Hara has spoken to that reform. I think our quarterly reports have spoken to the changes that have occurred in the city of Newark with respect to modern policing. But the Civilian Complaint Review Board is just one tool to improve transparency and for the community to review police practices and procedures and make recommendations to the police for change. But there are a number of different components. Citizens always have access to city council members. The city council controls NPD's budget. City council enacts or at least passes ordinances that the mayor will consider and either approve or not approve, sign or not sign. Residents of the city have access to the mayor. But in terms of the CCRB, the Supreme Court has spoken on the limits of its authority. And we knew that the Supreme Court ultimately would speak about it. And it's worth reading the Supreme Court's opinion, because what the Supreme Court is trying to do is strengthen the internal affairs units of police organizations to actually have them be thoughtful, robust, comprehensive in their investigations of police officers who violate the rules of the police organization. What I think the Supreme Court is commenting about is running parallel investigations where you have civilians running an investigation into an incident while internal affairs is running the same investigation, and while perhaps the prosecutor's office is running the same investigation. And what the court does not want is an overlap and perhaps interference by one with the other. So I think that the CCRB has a lot of authority to review practices, policies, training that NPD has adopted and is implementing. And I think it would be quite useful for the CCRB to exercise the authority it has been given under the ordinance as confirmed by the Supreme Court.
I just want to add to what Mr. Harvey's saying there. You know, I know there were a lot of folks who were, greatly disappointed that had gotten to the New Jersey Supreme Court, and subpoena power was then removed because the Supreme Court decision was different from what the appellate decision had said. The only thing I would say about that is obviously it's not over. There's always, like you mentioned, is the ability for legislatures to change the law. But separate from that, there is, a very, the CCRB under what is legal now does have the ability to be a very robust organization to ensure change. I think particularly, they have the ability to pull all of the internal affairs investigations and then review them, right? I mean, I know there's like confidentiality agreements and stuff like that that have to be executed, before and certain other steps before that actually happens. But if you think about it, it is what Mr. Harvey is saying, right? Like the Attorney General wants internal affairs to actually be effective at what they're doing across the state. There have been studies by different academics out there who actually say that, different CCRBs, depending on how they're constructed and so on, have actually been more lenient to officers than officers' internal affairs units have been across the country. And there's some academics who would say that, a police auditor type function can be more effective to bringing change. So I just want to point out that our CCRB has the ability to do that audit function, just like the monitor has now. And I think that can be very effective once that gets underway, because they'll be able to, once discipline is complete, they'll be able to review investigations and, be able to put sunlight on it, right? So like if investigations were not done, it wasn't fully investigated, or if an officer was, unfairly given some benefit in the course of investigation, that will come out because CCRB has the ability to do that now. And also, I think it's positive because CCRB will be able to say, look at the investigation and say, hey, wow, Newark Police really did a good job with this, right? And I think that will help, restore folks' trust in this process.
Great, thanks so much, Deputy Chief O'Hara. So we're getting some comments that are expressing concern that body cameras might not be an effective tool for police accountability because officers might not follow the rules. They might turn off their body camera when they're not supposed to. So what is NPD doing to make sure that all officers are following the new body camera policy?
Yes, so I think those concerns may come from, there are studies out there that show across the country where body cameras have been implemented that they don't really change anything, right? Like that police behavior doesn't actually change. That when officers record, they're recording bad behavior and there's no consequences for it, right? I think the difference here is that there has been, a very robust review program since the beginning, where officers are being held accountable. It is very rare that an officer does not record an incident, right? So if there is a complaint made, a citizen complaint made, and an officer was supposed to record the incident where the complaint happened, that's automatically now that complaint is going to be sustained against that officer. And cops don't want that to happen. It's very, very rare that officers are not recording things that they're supposed to. And when we find out about it, they are definitely held accountable. How that happened over time, it's how we kind of rolled this thing out. We had, there was like a trial period in the 5th precinct, and it was slowly brought on to other precincts. And as we did that, we were following up and auditing this ourselves. And a number of officers will tell you that, they had received what we call NDAs, non-disciplinary actions. They had received notices that we found out, we realized, hey, you shut the camera off too early, or, you turned it on too late, and those kinds of things. And I think now, like I mentioned earlier, there actually is support for these cameras. Unlike at the beginning, it was the total opposite. I've been told everything from I'm going to get cops killed to, that this is going to, the whole department will implode because we were pushing the whole body camera issue. And that's definitely not the case anymore, because officers have found it, for the most part, to be a tool that helps them more often than it hurts them. One thing that's interesting that we are working on to try and identify, things that are out there that may not come to our attention because there was no complaint, there was nothing serious, that there was no use of force, there was no search that happened, and things like that. And that is the use of artificial intelligence. And we're in a program with some folks from IBM, and they're actually looking for some funding from the business community now in Newark to keep it going. But basically, it's going to use AI to go through all of our videos twice a day and identify those videos that are high risk for something bad happening. Whether they identify like a curse word in the video or some sort of aggressive movement and things like that, and it'll streamline out like high risk type videos. And we can move now into an area where we say, okay, instead of just looking at every arrest, instead of looking at just every use of force, instead of looking at every stop, we're going to look at these videos that are like high risk type videos to try and identify behavior that would need to be corrected, right? Because again, the most common problem people have is the way officers are speaking to people and demeanor and so on. But a lot of times those things don't get reported. So if something like that happens, we'll be able to correct the problem through use of AI, and that's the goal of that.
I want to add to that too. Shortly before the body-worn camera policy was put in a final form and ultimately adopted by NPD, there was a shooting in Minneapolis in which a woman called 911. Officers came to her home, and one officer shot across another one out of the car window and killed her. Some of you may recall that incident. Minneapolis had a body-worn camera policy that allowed officers some level of discretion to cut them on and off. And we looked at their policy and revised the draft body-worn camera policy that Newark was considering at the time. And Deputy Chief O'Hara will remember this because he was chair of the consent decree planning unit, the implementation unit, and thought it was a good idea. So what we were trying to do was narrow the discretion that an officer has not to cut on the camera and to expose the officer to certain repercussions, namely discipline, if the officer doesn't turn on the camera. So the body camera and the car cameras are just two tools. They also, at the end of the day, have to be, how can I put it? They have to be merged with other things, training and supervision. Cops who decide not to follow the rules, I'm not talking about cops who make honest mistakes. Cops who make an affirmative decision not to follow the rules do not get away with it when there are good managers paying attention to them. Good managers review those videos, go to the policy, report it to internal affairs, and they take action against the police officers, which does two things. Lets that officer know, we don't do that here. I don't know where you learned this, but we don't do that. And secondly, it's a deterrent to other officers to say, I'm not going to end up like that guy. So think about body cameras and car cameras as two of many tools available in a changed way of delivering police services to the community. And I might add, Newark PD has one of the more modern body camera policies, in part because it was informed by what happened in Minneapolis when those officers did not turn on their body cameras, which is something that would not have been allowed in Newark.
All right, thank you both. So a couple of people are wondering, when will the consent decree end? And when it does end, what type of support will NPD have to continue and sustain the reforms that they've established?
It's a very good question, one that we probably can't answer for this reason. The 5th year anniversary of the Newark consent decree will be May 5th of 2021. The 5th year anniversary of the establishment of the monitoring team will be July 12th of 2021. Because of the worldwide pandemic, and in particular the states of emergency that have been declared in New Jersey, we as a monitoring team and Newark as a police agency have not been able collectively to perform all the tasks required under this consent decree. As I mentioned before, in order to pass a task, and if you look at paragraph 174 of the Newark consent decree, it lists what the tasks are and what the data is, as Deputy Chief O'Hara explained, that have to be collected and analyzed and audited. Everything from stops, searches, arrests, body cameras, car cameras, internal affairs, property. Newark needs a 95% pass rate on those tasks, and you have to have it 2 consecutive audit periods. Now, the consent decree contemplates that it can be extended. The parties can agree to extend it, and the court can order it extended. So we will see where we are at the 5th year anniversary of the consent decree. And then the parties will have a discussion about it. And ultimately the court will make a decision about it regarding its extension.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So another question we have is, while we're talking about youth engagement, making sure officers are competent in interacting with youth, is there also training being developed to relate it to mental health?
So is that training related to mental health in terms of dealing with folks who are in crisis? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So, you know, we're very fortunate here that Mayor Baraka made a commitment a year or two ago that, you know, every time we're bringing on police officers, we're, you know, the police department budget is also being used to hire social workers at the same time. So I can tell you where we are with that as of, you know, as of this year, we have in the budget enough money to hire 100 police officers. So what the mayor has mandated is we're going to hire another 10 social workers through the police department at the same time, which is tremendous. As Mr. Harvey mentioned, the mayor established the Office of Violence Prevention this past summer, and Director Lakeisha Yuri, you know, has been very, very much engaged around the clock in terms of, you know, developing that office and making it into something very robust that will help the police department better deal with victims, in particular, you know, folks who are repeat victims around, you know, issues of domestic violence and that type of thing. But what comes along with the Office of Violence Prevention is this sort of more focused, more directed effort to provide social services and to better use social workers. And I can tell you that even just a week ago, Director Yuri went out to a scene with Lieutenant Carrillo, one of the folks who work in this office here, to help deal with you know, someone who's having mental health issues. That was kind of like a repeat caller to the police. So I think through the Office of Violence Prevention, that's going to change the dynamics, just you know, not only in terms of dealing with, you know, community violence and domestic violence and those types of things, but also better enable us to respond to folks with mental health issues, because it tends to be a small percentage of folks who are experiencing the most severe mental health issues, and those are the folks that we're coming in contact with the most. So through that work, through the social workers, you know, we're very hopeful that it will be dealt with in a different way, obviously, but also in a way that's much more effective than just sending the police over and over again to deal with that type of thing.
Thank you. So the next question is, are you monitoring the disciplinary action taken against officers? For example, why might Officer A and Officer B be treated differently for the same infraction?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, we are. Both are.
Okay. So just to let folks know, probably, I don't remember, probably about a year and a half ago, we had a community meeting where we were talking about the disciplinary matrix. Since then, since the last time we talked about it, that policy was implemented, but there was, I believe, a PERC decision. It's like an administrative law decision in New Jersey that basically told the police department we can't enforce that policy at this time because it's something that is mandatorily negotiable with the unions. So because it wasn't a subject of contract negotiations, the police department cannot enforce it. So that's officially where we are with that. I can tell you the reality is, the matrix that was developed, both with, input from civil rights folks at DOJ, and obviously the monitoring team, and then clearly the community, feedback we received from the community, it is very robust. And, I personally believe in it because of the issue that person is bringing up tonight. How else are you supposed to tell in a department with 1,000 people when someone does something today that's similar to what somebody did 6 months ago, that they receive the same type of discipline? Particularly when, there's different, we call it trial boards. It's like a tribunal of 3 people that hear, major discipline in the police department. So it might be, today it might be myself, Captain Rollins, and Lieutenant Uri hearing a case that, 2 weeks from now, it's a different set of 3 people that are hearing a case that's very similar to what we heard 2 weeks ago. So it's only through the use of that matrix that we can really ensure that, there's parameters set, that it accounts for, aggravating and mitigating factors, and that we ensure that, discipline is issued, fairly, equitably, is comparable to different folks at different times. And so even though the disciplinary matrix itself is technically not the official policy of the department, I can tell you that all of us still lean on that when we have to go and sit on these trial boards, because we want to look at it and use it as a guide to make sure that we're being fair and equitable in terms of how this happens. People forget, because we spend so much time talking about these major issues with law enforcement, with the stop, search, and arrest, and the use of force and all that stuff. But people forget that when the ACLU brought their petition in 2010, it was made up of lawsuits that were settled by the city, and about half of the money that the city had to pay out was as a result of unfair and disparate discipline and excessive discipline that had been, administered by the police department to its own employees. So clearly, the only way to avoid, improperly and excessively disciplining folks, or disciplining folks differently, and having like a disparate impact in discipline, is to ensure that you have some standard, some guideline to follow. And if you're not doing that, you're going to cost the taxpayers money. So it's something that we think is common sense, and we're still following it. But in terms of whether or not it's going to be the official policy of the department, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens with these, administrative hearings.
To put a finer point on what Deputy Chief O'Hara has said, the disciplinary matrix, as we understand it as a monitoring team, is just one of several tools that are used as a point of reference. But at the end of the day, NPD makes its disciplinary decisions using a comprehensive analysis, and there is no single tool that is identified as being the reason or the guide for a particular disciplinary scenario, particularly while litigation is pending with respect to not only the disciplinary policy, but also the disciplinary matrix. Let me also explain, that is as we understand it. Let me also explain this concept that I think is useful. One of the challenges that led to the consent decree was a finding by the Department of Justice in 2014 that out of many complaints, dozens of complaints that have been made against Newark police officers, only one had been sustained. Well, that world has changed. If you look back at the quarterly report we issued at the end of 2019, which covered the months September through December of 2019, what you'll see is a changed world. There were 3 officers who were terminated. There were over 70 officers who were disciplined, varying degrees of suspension for those more than 70 officers. There also were a number of civilians who were suspended, varying degrees of time because they violated the rules. In our 16th quarterly report, we are going to report on the disciplinary actions taking place as of the end of year 2020. Now, what is typical in internal affairs, which is one of the reasons we recommended to NPD that we make police complaints readily available on the website, city offices, so that citizens can get them rather quickly. What is typically the case is there is as you begin to collect data on internal affairs, there's a spike up. And as the organization pays closer attention to it, it levels off and then it starts to come down because officers begin to understand that these issues will be investigated thoroughly, quickly. They will be given great attention immediately, and that there will be a consequence. So there is a spike up from the complaints, a spike up for the disciplinary action taken, and then a leveling off and then a decline. And the decline represents recognition by officers that, hey, I'm not going to do that. I'm not putting my paycheck at risk. I'm not putting my career at risk. I'm not putting the community at risk by engaging in that kind of behavior because I'm in an organization that doesn't tolerate it. And I think that that is what is happening in Newark. So we will know from our next quarterly report how discipline has occurred and to what extent discipline has occurred in the year 2020. And we are also going to contrast that with what the Department of Justice originally found in 2014, what we learned in 2019, and what we learned in 2020. So the community can have a real snapshot about how discipline is happening. And one point that Deputy Chief O'Hara has made in the past, and I'll make it this time to remind him of it, is we are in an environment in Newark where officers are reporting other officers. I cannot tell you how significant that is. That usually does not happen in sick police departments. Police departments that are trying to bury behavior that they don't want explored do not have that. Officers really fall behind a blue wall and they don't report one another, and they make excuses for one another, and they try to bury it. And that is why body cameras matter, car cameras matter, data matters, because officers essentially make the decision, I am not putting my career and my good work and my reputation at risk because you've decided to intentionally violate the rules of the organization. Don't ask me to cover for you for that. And that is a healthy environment because it serves in and of itself as a deterrent.
All right, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for the community survey. So I think this will be our last question. I'll definitely make sure that we all leave here with some contact information because I know there were a lot of great comments and questions that we didn't get to. So I'll make sure we all leave with that. But the final question is, the Biden administration seems focused on police reform and a return to implementing consent decrees. If asked, what lessons learned would you share with the administration based on your experiences?
And who should answer that, Brooke?
I think both could weigh in. I think that'd be great.
Well, I will offer just some very few comments, less than 60 seconds. I would urge the Biden administration to look at the quarterly reports, look at the progress that's being made in Newark. I would urge them to resume the Obama administration's investigation of police organizations and place them under consent decrees. But I would also encourage them to put funding in place to help police organizations write better policies, write new training, and also help give them grants so that they can bring in experts to teach them bias-free policing, anti-racist policing, and to teach them the history of their own cities and indeed American history. It's extraordinary to me how ignorant Americans are of the history of this nation and the history of policing, and how there are many practices that go on in police organizations that could be corrected. So I would urge the Biden administration to look at what we are doing in Newark, pursue consent decrees, but also provide funding to help police organizations as they try to reform themselves, because some are in cities that are poor, and poor cities have city councils and mayors that will not fund what it takes to reform police organizations.
So, what I could add to that is, obviously, I believe in the work that's happening here. Is the consent decree process perfect? No, not at all. I think Newark is very fortunate that we have kind of a perfect storm of folks involved in this process who truly believe in it. Whether we were going to have a consent decree or not, they believe in police reform, right? From our mayor straight on down through the public safety director to the officers that are sitting at the table here with me. And now I would say what's different today than 5-10 years ago, I think the majority of the rank and file officers here also believe in making these efforts as well. So yes, consent decrees are important, but I think there's room to make them different. I think like Mr. Harvey said, funding obviously would help, but I think perhaps a more collaborative process, if it could be created, one that, somehow, I know there's time constraints that get, sort of placed in these consent decrees. But if there was more of a shared burden between all the folks involved to kind of get at the table and try and work collaboratively to, I think, try and make some of these things happen. Because as Mr. Harvey said, the reality is, a lot of the civil rights issues that give rise to consent decrees are happening in cities with the greatest concentration of disadvantage, right? With not the best tax base and so on, and with a whole bunch of other problems going on at the same time. And the reality is consent decrees get implemented differently in different cities. Like I believe in Ferguson, there's someone from the DOJ who's actually there with the police department, and at least there was in the past, that was in-house there that was helping them get things done. So I think there's different ways to think about it, but I think it's very important that this work continues, because I think the results are very positive for everyone involved.
All right, well, thank you both so much. I think we're going to use the remaining time to give people an opportunity to respond to our community online survey. We talked a little bit about the last survey's results. It's a really important metric for us. We really want to hear how Newark residents are feeling about these reforms. So we'll share that information, and we hope you do take time to take the survey. But before we start the survey, I was wondering, Deputy Chief O'Hara, for those of us who didn't have our questions answered, could you please share how we can contact NPD to share our comments and questions?
So anyone can get on npdconsentdecree.org and reach out for us that way. There's you can enter a comment directly or a question directly in there on the homepage there. Or separately, if I don't know if you're able to, Brooke, if you're able to sort of collect everything that's there, we'll respond to those answers, and both of us can post them on our respective websites. We could do something like that if that's possible.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody tuning in. In a few seconds, you're going to see information on your screen about how you can take the online community survey. Again, we really hope that you do take time to complete it now or in the next few weeks. For further events like this in the future, please monitor the Institute's social media accounts. We'll be sure to publicize it there. And thank you to the independent monitor, Peter Harvey, and Deputy Chief O'Hara, and everybody from NPD for joining us tonight. And thank you all for tuning in. Have a great.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you to the Institute. Stay well. Stay well, everybody.